Oh. Okay. I'm real happy that Buzz asked me to do this introduction. I had never met Bob Madsen prior to the search for an executive presbyter. And let me first stop. Any of you familiar with that term, the executive presbyter of a presbytery? Some of you may remember Sanford Turner, who was our longtime executive presbyter, and we have a former executive presbyter online, I think, today. I see the executive presbyter for a presbytery as being kind of the pastor to pastors and the shepherd of all the congregations. That's just the way I envision it. And we have been without a permanent executive presbyter in South Alabama for several years, being handled very well by other staff members and interim executive presbyter. During that period of time, due to finances in both the Presbytery of South Alabama and the Mississippi Presbytery, during the period of our interim presbyter, Mississippi and South Alabama combined forces. So you see Bob's title as the regional executive presbyter, and he has the very small job of dealing with the presbyteries of South Alabama and the whole Presbytery of Mississippi. Just nothing, right, Bob? Right. Piece of cake. Well, I'd never met Bob, and we had the Presbytery appointed a committee of 6, including one from Mississippi, including ruling elders and teaching elders from South Alabama, and we began our search for an executive presbyter. Bob was on this committee, and we were doing all of our work by Zoom. So Bob was a very steadfast, very serious member of the committee, very helpful in getting us going, etc. And we were contacted by someone that said, you know, you really ought to consider Bob Madsen for this position. And so we told Bob that, and he was like, no way, no way. And then all of us began praying about it. Bob and Linda began praying about it. And Bob said, maybe I do want to throw my hat in the ring. And he did, and he stepped down from the committee. At that point, I had met Bob on Zoom. I had met his cat and his grandfather, because he's a very shy sort of individual. He's not self-deprecating, etc. He didn't even want you to see his face on Zoom. So oftentimes we met the cat and the grandfather, and one time a brick wall in the basement. So that's all I knew about Bob. We reviewed about 70 applications and interviewed 4 individuals, including Bob. The interview was the first time I had ever met Bob Madsen. The interview processes of those 4 individuals is the first time some of us had ever met several other individuals on the committee. We, Mobile's people, some of us had never met the guy from Mississippi. So this was all done very, very successfully, I think, through Zoom. And Bob emerged as the finalist. We met 2 times after the interviews were complete. Did a lot of prayerful searching of what God's will was, and decided that Bob's what God wanted. And so we put him before the presbyteries of Mississippi and South Alabama, and they unanimously approved him. Yes, sir.
How influential was the cat?
It was a cute cat. Now, we never met the dog. He was telling me about the dog this morning, but he says it zips back and forth across the yard, so he never could capture it on Zoom, I guess. Bob is a graduate of Columbia Theological Seminary. He's been in the ministry for about 31 years, probably 32 now. I think the biography was 31 at the time we were assembling the biography. He and his wife, Linda, have been married for 28 years. And he comes to us from Andalusia, from the First Presbyterian Church, where he was the pastor for 8 years. So it's been a sacrifice on their part to give him up to come to serve the greater good of 2 presbyteries. He'd served previously at Gulf Shores, not immediately previously, the interim between that and Indiana, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's served in New Jersey, he served in Tennessee. So he's been around very successfully at other churches. They moved from Andalusia not knowing where they were going to locate closer to the offices of Mississippi and South Alabama. But they have purchased a house in Saraland. The dog loves it, apparently. And so we're just very, very glad to have Bob serving this church and all of the other Presbyterians in South Alabama and Mississippi. Again, a small job. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, and it's humbling to listen to Judy think that I'm worth listening to, and I'm going to need to move over. Okay, I've got to have my papers in front of me, otherwise I don't know what to say, which could be to our advantage if I left them in the folder. If it's all right with you, I thought what I would do this morning is do something that I'm very uncomfortable doing, as Judy alluded to, and that's putting myself in front of you and talk a little bit about who I am so you have a sense of me. Sanford Turner used to say, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And so I'm kind of thinking that maybe knowing a little bit about me might give me a little more credibility than I'm entitled to at first pass. Judy mentioned that I've been in the ministry for 31 years, and I have, and I've bounced around a little bit. I graduated from Columbia in 1990. I always like to go around churches and find connections that I might have with those congregations. And I knew this before coming this morning, but one of my classmates was Dick Newsom, and Dick was associate pastor here. We graduated in 1990, so it was 1990 that he came to be associate pastor. And Vernon Hunter was buddies with the fellow that I worked with in Franklin, Tennessee, Tom Walker. Tom had been at Central Church in Mobile. He arrived the week before Hurricane Frederick. And if you do Facebook and you look at the Presbytery's timeline, I think we call it, I think they used to call it their wall, but now it's a timeline. You'll see pictures from Friday. We had guests here from Nashville who had been members of the Franklin Church when I was associate pastor. And one of the things that we wanted to do was go down and tour Central Church so they could see where Tom had been before he was lured away to Franklin. And so we spent a little time in that sanctuary, lovely sanctuary, and it was good. I wrote a little note with the pictures. It was good to close that circle from our lives together. Another connection I have is, where'd Billy go? There's Billy McLean's eyes and earphones. Billy's mother-in-law, daughter, and her family were members of the Franklin Church when I was associate pastor there. And so we got to know Billy and Sue and their families, during that time. So those are my connections to Spring Hill, other than my wife broke her ankle in May, and we have the orthopedic group on speed dial. And so we were back and forth a number of times for her appointments. And we ate Jersey Mike sub sandwiches in your parking lot a couple times because you've got a nice shady spot. So we're grateful for that. I'm very grateful for Buzz and Anna. Before ever I knew them, I knew people who knew them, who think very highly of them, and their opinion has been confirmed in my experience. So I am very grateful to have the two of them in our presbytery and here at this church, and to count them among my friends. Whether they count me among their friends, I don't care. I count them among my friends. And then finally, thanks to Judy and the rest of the Regional Presbyter Search Committee. I remember a conversation early on in the life of that committee in which there was some discussion as to whether this person would be the regional executive presbyter, and some people like the sound of regional presbyter better. My business cards say regional presbyter because my memory was they decided to take the word executive out so that whoever they chose wouldn't think they had too much power. And I think that was a good move on my part. So in a nutshell, sort of, here are some details from my life. I was born in Minnesota, and I was born in 1959 in Minnesota. And we lived there until I was 8 years old. And my father was transferred to Birmingham. He worked with Pure Oil Company, which was bought up by Union 76. And he was an auditor. And so we came to Birmingham. We were there. We got there in 1967. That's a bit of a culture shock for a boy from Minnesota in 1967, but I didn't know that until I was about 30 years old, and I figured out that it was a culture shock. I was just 8 years old, and we found a church that accepted us warmly. It was Second Presbyterian Church in Birmingham, if you're familiar at all. I think it's on what's called the Columbiana Highway, and we were there. At the time, the minister was a fellow by the name of Mickey Duke, William H. Duke. 5 years later, Dad was transferred to the Atlanta office for Union, and we lived in Stone Mountain. And I was there until I graduated seminary, with one brief foray to North Carolina for a year at St. Andrew's Presbyterian College in Laurinburg, because of the influence of the associate pastor of the church that I was a member of. At the end of that year, I was on a $1,000 scholarship. My grandparents had kicked in some money. My parents had kicked in some money. I had some savings. At the end of the year, I couldn't figure out how I was going to come up with the $3,000 that I needed in addition to that $1,000 scholarship. So I moved back home and went to Georgia State University. I tell you that story because I've heard the numbers that parents talk about these days for educating their kids, and I'm just amazed at what it has become. And I understand inflation and how $4,000 in 1977 and 78 would be different now, blah, 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 blah. But holy cow, do parents have a challenge with educating their children. So I was in Atlanta then until I graduated seminary. I had the notion of becoming a minister when I was a teenager, like many folks do. And then other people began to think that that would be a really great thing for me to do. And like many other young people, I decided I needed to rebel against the support of the community that was shaping me into the type of person that thought he might want to be a minister. And so I fled the church for a number of years and ended up at Westminster Presbyterian Church in Snellville, Georgia. Anybody know Snellville, Georgia? You do? Okay, everybody's somebody in Snellville. That was the motto of the town when I was there, and they'd have Snellville days, and Boss Hogg from the Dukes of Hazzards was the Grand Marshal one year. Another year it was Bill Curry, who was at that time coach of the football team at Georgia Tech. And he brought this fella in a navy blue sport coat with lots of dandruff. Hope I don't get sued for saying that. It's not derogatory, it's just descriptive. Turns out that guy was George Plimpton, the sports writer in Westminster Presbyterian Church in Snellville for the men's breakfast, while Bill Curry was talking about football. But the fellow who was pastor there had been an intern at Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church, where our family had been members at the time that Bob Ramey was the pastor. And so Jim was pastor, and I called him one day and I said, I'd like to talk about whether I ought to go to seminary. And I was driving home from work. I was I'd graduated with a degree in journalism, worked for a couple small newspapers in Fayetteville, and then went to work for a company publishing medical newsletters. And I was driving home in Atlanta traffic at 5:30 on an afternoon, sitting at a intersection of, I believe, Briarcliff and Cheshire Bridge, and sitting at a traffic light at Briarcliff and Cheshire Bridge, and sitting at the traffic light, thinking about the conversation I was going to have the next morning, and just suddenly decided it wasn't a question of whether, but how. How do I do this? How do I go to seminary? So I met Jim for sausage and biscuits the next morning. We talked about it. Now, I realized there are other fine theological institutions associated with the Presbyterian Church. But I'd lived in Stone Mountain for, I don't know, at that point, it was 14, 15 years. And I knew where Columbia Theological Seminary was. And I knew Shirley Guthrie was at Columbia Theological Seminary. So it didn't occur to me to think about any other seminary. And so I talked with Jim about that. He arranged a meeting with Davison Phillips, who was president at that time. If you never knew Davison, you missed a wonderful, wonderful person. He was a terrific fellow. And we sat and we talked, and he was very gracious, and he asked me what I wanted to do. And I said, well, I've got a degree in journalism. Maybe I'll graduate and then go to Louisville and write Sunday school curriculum. Well, that seems like a fine idea, was basically what he said to me. And 4 years later, I did a year-long internship at First Church in Birmingham. But 4 years later, when I graduated and it was time to start looking for work, nobody had told me that Louisville was going through a major curriculum revision, and my services were not going to be needed when I graduated seminary. And so I also began to think that congregational life might be a better choice. And I ended up in East Brunswick, New Jersey. I had never considered moving to New Jersey. I didn't have any bias against New Jersey. It had just never been on my radar. And for the life of me, I still don't know how it is that in the providence of God, I ended up in the shadow of Princeton Theological Seminary, but I made good use of their library in the 5 years that I was there. Had a marvelous colleague, a marvelous experience. And in 1995, I got a phone message that I had, that Tom Walker wanted me to call him. And Tom Walker, I knew, was also a seminary classmate who last I knew, he was in Indianapolis at the same church where Anna did her late fellowship, Second Presbyterian Church in Indianapolis. He was theologian in residence, but I had friends in Indianapolis, and the area code of this phone number was not Indianapolis, so I didn't know what this was about. I called the number and I said, I'm returning a call from Tom Walker. And after I was put on hold, Tom Walker came on the line and said, Robert, my name's Tom Walker. How are you today? And I knew that it was not the Tom Walker I knew. So we ended up moving to Franklin in 1995, and the church had just moved into a new facility at the north end of Franklin. If you're at all familiar, it's the chapel in front of the Legends Club golf courses. There's 2 championship 18-hole golf courses, and in their front yard is First Presbyterian Church of Franklin. We were there 7 years, and another great experience with a pastoral colleague. When Tom retired in 2002, I felt it was important for me to get out of the way, because Tom and I thought an awful lot alike, and the church needed to make its decisions about its future absent me as an anchor. And so I ended up in Gulf Shores, and I was there for 3 years. And then we went to Bluffton, Indiana, where we were for another 8 years. And then in 2013, we came to Andalusia, and I was with that congregation for about 8 years. Throughout the course of that time, there were good years and bad years, as you might imagine. Life in the church is never as rosy as we always hope it will be. Often it is. So I had good experiences, I had difficult experiences, and I have always struggled with the issue of general providence versus particular, what I would call particular providence. To what degree is God sovereign and working in the world, and to what degree is God sovereign and working in my life? But as I look back over the course of my life and the places I've been and the people who have influenced me, I can't help but wonder if there isn't just a little bit of providence going on in all of that prepares me for where we are today. We won't be able to answer that question in my lifetime, but I think it's important to entertain it. Somebody else further down the road will decide whether my occupying of this position was a terrible mistake or a great cosmic joke or providential. But I do think it helped shape me in a way that will influence how I operate in this position. Now, the position of regional presbyter or executive presbyter, Judy gave you, I think, a very good description of how I'm approaching it these days. And again, I've only been in the position since the 1st of November, so there's a lot left to learn. But pastor to pastors and shepherd of congregations sounds like a good description. We just a little over a year ago, as a presbytery, adopted a new structure because our 7-year plan and the structure that accompanied it had expired a couple of years ago, and we thought we need to have a new plan. And as we were working on a plan for ministry, we also came up with the notion of a structure. We recognized that Samford had the world in his head. And when he retired, the structure didn't support us as well as we might have wished, because he took his brain with him. And while we can call him on the phone, he's retired and we can't make him do all the work of the presbytery anymore. And so we developed this structure that is very dependent upon the committees of the presbytery, in the same way that a session works through its committees. And Buzz chairs our congregational and connectional life, is that what we call it? And Anna chairs the committee on ministry and nurture. There's another word in there. And I brought them with me because I knew what my committee on ministry, care, and congregational nurture. Other folks chair our administration and finance committee. We've got a mission and evangelism committee. And what we are working toward is developing that structure so it is the backbone of the ministry of the presbytery. And my function is to be supportive of all those other folks and all those other groups, but not be the linchpin of everything. So if I do my work well, in a few years, nobody will even know I'm around, and I'll just take very long lunches and then go home because I just won't matter anymore. But the presbytery will hopefully be functioning in a way that is self-sustaining, which brings me to an important point, and that is, if you are not on a presbytery committee, we can solve that for you. We can find a spot for you, because it's going to be very dependent upon our elders participating in those structures. We've got, I think it's 22 churches, some of which are without ministers, some of which have associate pastors, but not many of them. So the pastoral contingent in our presbytery is relatively small. We've got a lot of retired ministers who enjoy being retired and don't want to be called out of retirement, so they make it hard for us to find them, except for Billy. There's Billy. Billy's still there. So a lot of work will depend upon our success in getting elders plugged into the different committees. When I left Andalusia to start the work as regional presbyter, I preached that following Sunday in Andalusia because a baptism had been scheduled, and I stood and I said to the congregation, "Grace to you and peace from God our Heavenly Father and our Lord Jesus Christ," which is how I began worship services regularly. And then I added, "and greetings from the presbyteries of South Alabama and Mississippi." And I did that a couple more times when I was speaking places. And then I realized, as I'm saying that to folks sitting out in the pews, I am speaking to the Presbytery of South Alabama or the Presbytery of Mississippi. I am not the Presbytery of South Alabama or the Presbytery of Mississippi, and neither is the office in Daphne. Mississippi doesn't have a physical office. Susan Summerall is the stated clerk and a member of the church, the Briarwood Church in Jackson. And she has an office there for her work with the church and just uses that as well for her work as stated clerk. So there is no presbytery apart from the members of our churches. So greetings from yourself is what I was saying when I would say greetings from the Presbytery of South Alabama. So again, it's important to think about ways in which you might participate in our work and our ministry. You probably know that the word from which we get presbytery, Presbyterian, presbyter, is a Greek word that means shepherd. It's been translated as bishop. It's been translated as elder. We are organized around that kind of shared leadership. Not one person is a leader, the leader in any group in a Presbyterian church. Somebody may take a key leadership role, but we lead together. And we do that for a very important reason, which brings me to my favorite doctrine of the church, the doctrine of total depravity. We are all sinners. We are all sinners. And I really do love that piece of Presbyterian theology because it tells me a couple things. One, I am a victim of sin. Sin is something I do not control. Sin is all around us. Somehow or another, we get caught up in it. But I am not guiltless. I'm both a victim and a participant in the web of sin. So it reminds me that I have responsibility. So we organize our life together in ways that is intended to keep any one person from running off with the store and directing everybody's traffic. We're to be in leadership together. And I take that very seriously. I can give you a list of people who would not say that I was a good colleague in ministry, but I think I can also give you a list of people who would say that I'm a good colleague in ministry. And that's important to me, that we work collegially, that we work together. One of the things that I am completely aware of is that my position is not a constitutional position. Al Thompson is the stated clerk of our presbytery. Cindy Wilson is the moderator of our presbytery. Cindy will soon be gratefully handing the gavel off to Blair Beaver at the Bay Minette Church. But my position is not a constitutional position. I am an employee of the Presbytery of South Alabama. I'm not an employee of the Presbytery of Mississippi. They subsidize the salary package and the cost of the executive presbyter position, and I give them a quarter of my time. But I'm an employee of the Presbytery of South Alabama. And last I checked, Alabama is a right to work state, which means I can be fired at a moment's notice. And I'm kind of anxious about that reality. But that's the truth. My position is not an ecclesial position. Stated clerk and moderator. Those are the ecclesial positions in the presbytery. So my work is entirely about helping our system and our people do their work. I'm going to pause for a moment, take a dramatic sip of coffee, and ask, are there any questions about things to this point? Or do I keep going on and on?
Would you please explain what you mean by ecclesial position?
Yep, a position in the church. I occupy a position that is borrowed from the corporate world. That came, I have to do some research on this, but my suspicion is that it came into the life of the church during the baby boom generation, when churches were growing so fast and our denominations were growing so fast, and we needed executives to steer the work of a presbytery. But it's not in our Constitution. Buzz and I were talking about officer training here, and he reminds you folks that we are people of the books. We're people with book of order and the order of books. The order of books: Scripture first, book of confessions, our theology second, and the book of order, our governmental structure third. So an executive presbyter is not in the constitutional structure of the government of the church. And sometimes I slip the word ecclesial in there because it's a fancy way of saying church. And so if that contributed to the confusion, I'm sorry. So I'm in the organizational chart of the Presbytery, but not in the constitution of the Presbyterian Church. The question caused me to think of one thing. One of the other things that I think I bring to this position is my longevity. Means that I was baptized in the old UPC USA, the Northern Church. I was confirmed in the PCUS, the Southern Church, and I was ordained in the PCUSA, the Reunited Church. My blood runs Presbyterian blue until the day I die, and I don't know what will happen then, but I am Presbyterian through and through, and am grateful for that. I know no other way to be a disciple of Jesus Christ than as a Presbyterian. There's nothing wrong with being a disciple of Jesus Christ in other ways. It's the only way I know, and I'm grateful for our traditions and our history. Anything else before I try to bring you to tears? Yes.
When were you at first in Birmingham?
When was I at first? I was there, let's see, I graduated in 90. So I was there the academic year of 1988 to 1989. The pastor at the time was Bob Crutchfield. Eugenia Gamble, who is a member of our Presbytery, and her name is probably known to you from Curriculum and Horizons. She became pastor of that church several years after I was gone. Interestingly, the church had an assistant pastor. The Book of Order used to have the position of assistant pastor in it, and with reunion, assistant went away and associate was the position. The last assistant pastor of First Birmingham left because he was called to be pastor of the church in Andalusia. And so many years later, I end up following him in Andalusia. The pastor of our church in Birmingham, Second Church, Mickey Duke, had been pastor of the Gulf Shores and Orange Beach congregations when they were a yoked parish back in the early 60s. And I was going through things one day and I came across Mickey's name there and learned that. The Presbyterian world is small, and we keep overlapping and making connections. And I find that really wonderful and amazing when we find those connections. Let me move away. Am I supposed to be stopped yet? No. Let me move away from me and talk more about the church. I should have asked, how many of you are lifelong Presbyterians or long enough Presbyterian that you're confident of your knowledge of how we're structured? Pretty good crowd. Briefly, the basic unit of government is the church session, the local church session. From there, we go to presbytery level, which is a geographic area. South Alabama, is a combination of the old Mobile Presbytery and some churches from the old John Knox Presbytery, which was centered in Montgomery. So our churches over on the eastern side come from that orientation: Dothan, Enterprise, Geneva, Andalusia. And then you jump from Andalusia to Baldwin County to get to the next member of our family. So we, at the time of reorganization, those churches from those two presbyteries were brought together. And then above that, you have the synod level, which for us encompasses Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama. And then we're at the General Assembly level. The offices for the General Assembly are in Louisville, and the Assembly is meeting every 2 years as a body. But we have the office of the General Assembly and the Presbyterian Mission Agency in Louisville, who are responsible for the day-to-day work of the church in between the meetings of the General Assembly itself. So that's us in a nutshell. We're organized in committees, which means we sometimes work slower than we might like. Hopefully, it means we work more faithfully than we might otherwise. That's not a guarantee. But one of the gems of wisdom in our Book of Confessions is that all councils of the church are subject to error. So we recognize that our form of government does not make us perfect, but it helps to point us in the direction of faithfulness. And we are the church reformed, always being reformed. And so we always have the opportunity to come back and correct our mistakes. We are a thinking denomination. We are a thoughtful denomination. Others are too, but I'm proud of being Presbyterian. So I'm grateful for that piece of our heritage, that we come at things hopefully in a manner that's not a knee-jerk reaction, an emotional response, though emotions are a significant way of being in the world, but that we come at things from what I like to think of as from a theological perspective that involves the intellect. We're a thinking, processing, deliberative body when we're at our best. So we developed this we developed this new structure in light of the expiration of the former 7-year plan, to try and build that framework, that skeleton, that backbone that will enable us to work effectively together in ministry. It's a process that is unfolding. We wrote it. We adopted it as a presbytery. We have not put it on a shelf, as so many plans often get relegated to a shelf somewhere. It sits on my desk and it sits on other people's desks, and we're constantly attending to it, trying to live into that structure that we have set out for ourselves. And we know it's going to take a while to get to that point. And I think a big part of my job, in addition to being pastor to pastors and shepherd of congregations, I'm going to steal that often, Judy, so I'm grateful you said it that way, is to help our committees get into that groove, get into that structure, and begin to get a picture of what ministry can be. We also organized, as part of our organization, we brought back what had one time been called the Council of the Presbytery. We're calling it the Cabinet. And that is a gathering of the chairs of each of the committees, along with the moderator, current moderator of the Presbytery. The immediate past moderator is chair of the Cabinet. The stated clerk and I are both ex officio members of the Cabinet, and Julie Howard, who is the secretary for the Presbytery office, sits in with us so that when we forget or I forget what we talked about, she can remind me, because she's taken notes to help with that. So the Presbytery Cabinet meets periodically throughout the year. We increased the number of meetings of the Presbytery. We've been meeting twice a year. I think, did we go to 4 or 3? 4. We went to 4 Presbytery meetings, none of which we've been able to have in person yet because of that little thing called COVID. We're pointing right now to a March meeting, which may be possible to have in person. And let me pause and say how grateful I am for the leadership in this congregation that has helped you folks navigate the pandemic and do so wisely. If you hear me sniffling or coughing in your presence today, I've had both vaccines and a booster, but we have 2 rescue cats, and I'm allergic to cats, and I take antihistamines every morning, but I'm not without symptoms of living with cats. So I'm grateful that you've done that, but hopefully we'll be able to meet in person in March, and that'll be the first time. The whole point of the structure, that kind of heavy structure, has been to foster connections between our churches. Because I did a tour of duty 2002 to 2005 and then 2013 to the present, I'm aware of changes that have gone on in the Presbytery, and some of you might be as well, and that is a leadership cadre entered the ranks of retired folk, both ruling elders and teaching elders. And as we said a little while ago, retired folk like to be retired, and they don't want to have to do everything that they did when they weren't retired. And so when those folks retired, we lost them as leaders, and they're part of the memory of the Presbytery, still available to us. But as I said, there are other things that they want to do these days. So the whole point in going to this intense schedule of meetings, somebody is meeting every month out of the year, either a committee, the cabinet, or the Presbytery. And the hope is that we will build some of those connections again for the next generation of Presbyterians in South Alabama. In 2016, I was fortunate enough to be a commissioner to the General Assembly out in Portland. And I took a look around the room and discovered that there were a lot of faces in that room that were much younger than mine. And I began listening to how they were talking about church a little more intensively than I had prior to that. And what I discovered in doing that was the church that influenced me and shaped me to be the type of Presbyterian I am is a church that is passing away. And that's okay. I'm okay with that. I grew up in that baby boom generation when the church was highly structured, highly corporate. It was a model that served us well and allowed us to do various things, but we aren't that church anymore. And if we try to operate that way as that church, we're spinning our wheels, because what we're doing is investing ourselves in a structure that no longer serves us well. The structure that we've adopted here locally as a presbytery is intended to focus primarily on our congregations and their ministries. And I'm not saying that denomination hasn't done that, but we were far more hierarchical as I was coming up through the church. Now we've drifted into kind of a connectionalism where people think of the local church as the church and aren't so much concerned about the hierarchy of the church anymore. That has some good benefits, but it really weakens us in terms of who we are as a denomination. But we can bemoan that fact, or we can adapt to that fact and figure out, all right, how do we capture the things that are essential and best from our past, but utilize them in a way that serves us in the present. And the pandemic has been a marvelous example of why that's a necessity. We have all had to learn how to do church. When we've been used to thinking about church membership as you're in the pew on a regular basis, which has meant various things at various times in the life of the church, and you come to the church for meetings and you participate in things at the church, and for a good while we weren't able to gather with one another. One of the things that I remember Buzz talking about during the future focus group meetings is that you had ordained someone as a deacon who lived in Mississippi, and she was going to be interacting with her care group electronically, by telephone, by Zoom, by various ways. That then begins to push the boundary of how we think about the church. I don't have to live in this community to be a faithful member of this church. If I'm tuning in by Zoom, if I'm participating in the ways that I can electronically, if we cannot get together, we can still be church. There was an era in which the church, as many of us have known it, did not exist. And so we're moving into a new phase of the church's life. We adapt from the past, we adapt to the challenges of the present moment, and we begin to wonder about what the future is going to look like for us. Some folks think that online things will go away and ought to go away. Other folks think that they're part of the future because they're part of the now, and they're great tools. Judy mentioned that she's met my great-grandfather. as well as one of our cats. When we first started doing Zoom, we were cautioned all the time to shut down our video in order to save bandwidth so we'd have better connections. I don't really understand that. I just like to say it. And who did I noticed a couple folks were able to put up pictures and avatars of themselves. And I thought, well, that's really cool. And then, so I upgraded my computer so I could do that. And then I started thinking, okay, what am I going to put up there? And I've got this triptych of pictures in my office of my great-grandparents in Denmark, my great-great-grandparents in Denmark, my great-grandfather, and I'm assuming his picture was taken in the States. He came over in the mid to late 1800s in his fishing boat, we like to say. And then my dad's parents. So 3 generations of Presbyterian, of Scandinavians, 5 people, not a smile in the group. And I'm aware that when my photograph is taken, I will think that I'm smiling from ear to ear and I look like this. But inside I'm smiling. So I put great grandpa Madsen, Christian Madsen, up on the screen when I'm on Zoom. And I digressed from a point to get to there. I don't know how I did that. Oh, Zooming is just going to be part of our way of life. YouTube, online streaming, Facebook, all of those things. I think they're just part of the church. They are never a substitute. They are never a complete substitute for the body being able to gather. But they are a way for the body to gather if we cannot be physically present with one another. So I think they're going to prove to be important tools. Anything you want to object to or ask about? I'm winding up. I think we're getting close to our time, and I'm getting close to my Buzz said that I should share my vision and hopes for our presbytery. And I told him, well, I better get some vision and hopes for our presbytery. And my vision and my hope are not necessarily unique to our presbytery, but for the church as a whole, and for the Presbyterian PCUSA denomination. We've spent a lot of time during the 31 years that I've been in ministry arguing about different things and fighting about different things. And we've seen the results in the life of the denomination as we have argued and fought with one another. If you've got this book, A Brief History of the Presbyterians in your church library, find the diagram in there of the Presbyterian church. If you've driven through Atlanta or any other major city with some sort of interchange that people call the Spaghetti Junction, that's what the diagram of the Presbyterian church in the United States looks like. We have been dividing and combining and reconciling and running away from one another throughout our history. Because we're a deliberative body, because we discuss difficult issues, we end up fighting with one another from time to time, and we end up splitting from one another from time to time. And that has been to our detriment. So my hope is that we have reached a stage in the life of the denomination where we may more easily accept the fact that we differ on important issues. But the issues that are even more important, we agree on. I have chosen for my prayer of illumination when I preach to use a prayer based on the Barmen Declaration from 1930s Germany, when German Christians were fighting with one another over the all-important issue of what is the role of the church in an age like the one they were in. And we have become such a disjointed society, such a hostile society, and churches that speak about the gospel in ways that I don't recognize seem to have become the dominant voices for Christianity in our culture. That I think the Presbyterian church has to find a way to get heard where it's not currently being heard. So when I pray before reading scripture, I ask God to speak God's eternal and creative word. The one word we have to hear and trust. Shape us disciples, we may serve him faithfully in this life and eternally in the life that is to come. Our Reformed predecessors in Germany understood that Jesus Christ is the one word of God. Jesus Christ, as he's attested to us in scripture, is the one word of God we have to hear and trust and obey. We listen for where Christ is leading the church, and we follow where Christ is leading the church. Jesus is not a possession of the church. Jesus is the head of the body, and we are members of the body. Jesus is already out there in the world working in places that we can't even imagine. And our job is to figure out where he is and how to get there and assist him in the work of the gospel. And the work of the gospel, the proclamation of the gospel, takes a variety of shapes. It can be done concretely. It can be done in spoken word. It can be done in prayer. It can be done in song. Some people say it can be done in dance. I'm not entirely sure of that, but I'm an old fogey. Our job is to figure out where Jesus is calling us and then get over there and start doing what he has prepared us to do and what he has prepared for us to do. So my hope for our presbytery, for our denomination, for the church in general, is that our understanding of grace will shine forth in everything we do as a church, and people will hear a voice of the gospel that is refreshing and freeing, affirming, loving, challenging, and in some ways revolutionary. I hear people talk about grace, but it's grace but. You're saved by grace, but now you got to do this. Everything that comes after the word but, that belongs to God. Our job is the grace of God in Jesus Christ has been made known to us. Let's follow where that's leading us and go. Anything you want to fuss about, ask about? I think I filled enough it's 10 o'clock. There's no time for you to ask any questions. You got to go have coffee before you go to church. Thank you for your patience and for your attention. Thank you. I'll throw some business cards out here on the table if anybody wants one. If you want to argue with me at a later time, I'll be happy to hear from you.
I was just talking to Leslie Sweeney, our chair of worship, and she needs one more elder or deacon or former elder or deacon to serve communion. Anybody here and willing who isn't already signed up? This morning.
Easy because it's just one tray. The bread and
All right, we got James and thank you. We'll be meeting at 10:15, 10 o'clock.